Our second reading today is from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. There is another story Jesus told. Kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who planted good seed in his field. But that night, as everyone slept, his enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat. When the crop began to grow and produce grain, the weeds also grew. The farmer's servants came and told him, "Sir, the field where you planted that good seed is full of weeds. An enemy has done it," the farmer exclaimed. "Shall we pull out the weeds?" they asked. He replied, "No, you'll hurt the wheat if you do. Let both grow together until the harvest. Then I will tell the harvesters to sort out the weeds and burn them and to put the wheat in the barn." And may God speak to us through these verses today. Today's story is part of a series of parables that Jesus is speaking to a crowd in Matthew's gospel. And he begins each one by saying, "Listen, I'm going to tell you what God's kingdom is like." And he compares the kingdom to all sorts of images. Mustard seed, buried treasure, a bit of yeast mixed in the bread dough, valuable pearl, a fishing net, and so on. Last week, we heard him compare the kingdom to seed that was scattered on different kinds of soil, scattered by a rather eccentric farmer who didn't care if the soil was hard or thorny or fertile. Today, Jesus says God's kingdom is like another farmer who plants good wheat in a field, but during the night, someone sneaks into the field and plants weeds. And once the wheat starts to grow, the workers notice the weeds, so they ask the farmer, "Hey, didn't you plant wheat out there? Where'd these weeds come from?" And the farmer says, "An enemy must have done this." Now, when I researched this, I found out that apparently that sometimes happened back then. If you had a grudge against a farmer, or maybe you wanted to corner the wheat market, or even if you just wanted to make some mischief, you would sow weeds in a field. It would damage the crop, make the farmer's job harder. Of course, crops were so important back then that there were very tough laws for punishing whoever did that. Now, also, it would turn out that the farmer would be a laughingstock in the community because it meant that his enemy got the better of him. Weeds in a field would shame him, which is one reason the workers want to go out there and yank him out. They want to save their boss's reputation, among other things, maybe even their own reputations. You know, if you work for a laughingstock, it doesn't take too long until you are kind of one yourself. But this farmer is not worried about his reputation. Instead, he's worried more that the workers will yank out good wheat with the weeds. Now you would think, well, couldn't they tell the difference? Well, maybe. But there was a kind of weed called a tare, T-A-R-E. And tares looked so much like wheat, it was hard to tell them apart. The tare roots would intertwine with the wheat roots so tightly that if you yanked them out, it would uproot the wheat too. If the workers were careless or hasty, they would do more damage than good. So the farmer is willing to risk any kind of shame and ridicule of his neighbors rather than risk ruining his whole crop. Instead, he says, "I'll plan to deal with it at the harvest time. They'll burn the weeds and store the good grain." And this, says Jesus, is what God's kingdom is like. Clear as crystal, right? Well, apparently it was not so clear to some early Christians because several verses later, Matthew offers an explanation. I mentioned last week that Jesus really wasn't in the habit of explaining his story. Some scholars believe the gospel writers added those explanations. According to Matthew, the wheat represents good, righteous people, and the weeds are evil, sinful people. The harvest is judgment day, when righteous people will enjoy God's kingdom and sinful people will burn in flames. That's a very neat, tidy interpretation, although it does have a few problems. One problem is that Matthew seems to be turning the parable into more of a warning about future judgment. But Jesus starts this out by saying this is a parable about what God's kingdom is like. Another problem is Matthew's habit of sticking people into very simplistic categories. Last week, he suggested that everyone fits into one of four types of soil. Now he reduces the categories to only two: good and evil, righteous and sinful. Is it really that simple? Are we only one or the other? And how do we decide who is who? Although we do decide that, don't we? Human beings find it fairly easy to divide everyone up into good and evil, wheat and weeds. Often the evil weeds are anyone who does not agree with us. And once we make this distinction, we usually want to do something about it. Like the workers in Jesus' story, we want to start yanking out those weeds, get rid of them. The real warning in the parable, though, is not about some future judgment day. The real warning is about the farmer's fear that the workers will be too hasty or reckless in trying to weed out that field. So reckless, they'll just destroy it all. In other words, our methods for trying to get rid of the weeds could be worse than just leaving the weeds alone. Now, there are many terrible examples of weed pulling in human history. Adolf Hitler's final solution comes to mind: the Nazi attempt to purify the homeland by exterminating all the Jews. In the history of the church, we can find bloody attempts to purify the field, the Inquisition. Frankly, I get a little nervous even these days when I hear a lot of debate among Presbyterians about preserving the so-called purity of the church. And let us not forget, Jesus was crucified by a lot of people who considered him a weed, and they thought they were doing the right thing by yanking him out of the field. All through the Gospels, Jesus criticizes people who make quick, easy judgments about good and evil, about who is righteous and who is not. Jesus could see goodness in prostitutes and tax collectors, even though they did sinful things. Jesus could see evil in respectable folks and religious people, even though they did righteous things. So which are they, good wheat or evil weed? Do we base that kind of judgment on one thing someone does, or a variety of things? Is it based on how someone was in the past, or how they are now, or how they might be in the future? Let's suppose there's a man who volunteers at a soup kitchen feeding the hungry homeless people, but he's also cheating on his wife. Weed or weed? Suppose a man murders someone, spends years in prison. When he's released, he turns over a new leaf and lives a good life. Weed or weed? Suppose a woman works at a grocery store, steals food every day, takes it home to feed her children because she doesn't earn enough money to take care of a family. Wheat or weed? Or we could think on a much bigger scale. The United States has created a democratic society with all sorts of rights and freedoms and the highest standard of living in the entire world, in the history of the world. But we are also responsible for the genocide of Native Americans and slavery. Are we a wheat nation or a weed nation? And we also have to realize the limitations of any parable. Parables are only stories that try to give us a grasp of something much bigger. So we shouldn't take them too literally. After all, wheat and weeds can never be anything but what they are. But do we really believe that each one of us is born either good or evil, and we stay that way until we die? Or do we believe people can change? Do we believe we can be transformed? Jesus certainly seemed to believe we can. Otherwise, he was kind of wasting his time and died for nothing, didn't he? So perhaps the real question is, are there really good people and evil people? Or are we all just simply people who are sometimes good and sometimes evil, sometimes righteous and sometimes sinful? Last week, I said that when I examine my own heart with honesty, I find that I am all four types of soil, not just one. And today, I think I can say that in my own heart, I don't find a wheat or a weed, but instead a kind of hybrid of both, their roots twined together. And so maybe the wheat and weed in Jesus' parable are not two different types of people, but they are rather two different sides to the same person, to each one of us. One writer says that he once spent some time talking with a rabbi who claims that there is a very similar parable in the Jewish tradition. In that version, one of the farmer's workers stays up all night to learn the identity of the enemy who plants this bad weed out in the field. To his surprise, the enemy turns out to be the farmer himself. He's sleepwalking and scattering the weed seeds. Clever way of saying we are usually our own worst enemy. There's another story that comes from the native tradition of the Cherokees about an old man talking with his grandson, and he tells the boy, "There is a fierce battle going on inside of me. It is a battle between two wolves. One wolf is evil. It's made up of anger, envy, greed, lies, and hatred. The other wolf is good, made of joy, peace, love, humility, and kindness." And the old man says that these two wolves are locked jaw to jaw as they fight within him. And the grandson is listening all wide-eyed, and he asks, which wolf wins that fight? And the old man says, whichever one I feed. Same is true of the wheat and the weeds. Whichever one we cultivate and nourish, that's the one that grows stronger and probably eventually wins. And so, my friends, when we read this story, we should not see ourselves probably as the wheat, probably not even as the weeds, but rather as the field. Each of us is the field where both of those are growing. Let the wheat and the weed grow together, says the farmer, says God. We'll sort it out later. Now, if we want to, we can keep reading this as a parable about what happens to good people and bad people on Judgment Day. Or maybe we can read it as a story of what God's kingdom is like. The kingdom of a God who knows that there is wheat and weeds in each and every one of us. A God who values the good wheat in each of us, so much that God is patient with the weeds in all of us. A God who promises a harvest when the wheat and weeds in all of us are separated and the weeds are burned away with fire. But maybe not a fire of punishment, but more a cleansing fire, a fire that burns away evil and sinfulness, while goodness endures and lives on with God. When I was at seminary, I studied with a professor who was considered one of the top New Testament scholars in the world. And he argues that really that is what we call hell. That's what it's really like, what it's really for. He says that if there is a hell, it is not to punish us, but to purge us, to refine us the way gold is refined. You know, they dig up the gold ore from the ground, they put it in a fire that destroys all the impurities so that what comes out is pure. There are many Bible scholars and theologians who agree with this, and there are scripture verses to support that idea, even Paul. So maybe that's right. Of course, it does mean that we all, each and every one of us, must go through that cleansing, refining fire. Meanwhile, says Jesus, leave those people we think are weeds alone. Don't try to get rid of them because we'll do more harm than good. And frankly, we are not qualified to judge who is a wheat or weed, so it's not our job anyway. Instead, let's just all grow side by side and leave it all in God's hands. To be honest, most of the time, it seems to me that a lot of people just use religious beliefs as an excuse to justify their own hatred and prejudice. If the farmer in the parable, who is God, is not shamed or worried about the weeds, maybe we need to ask why we are so upset by them. Amen.